I'm
Hey,
on.
John, is that you?
It is me.
Oh, good.
Sounds
like you're having...
Yeah, problems.
Yeah.
Having internet problems.
Yeah.
So this has already been a very complicated morning. We have had internet connection problems at my home for at least a week now. In fact, I think some of the emails, I haven't gotten some of your emails, and you haven't gotten some of my emails. It's not that
I just noticed yesterday that some were bouncing back.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it comes and goes. It's very slow, but sometimes things get through, and it would almost be easier if it was completely dead. But it's
so get your hopes up, and then only to dash them to the rocks.
But I've called Verizon, and so has my wife a few times, and they keep telling us that our line is perfectly fine, and it's got to be a problem with our equipment here, a router or something. And then we found out, or Susie was talking to a few friends yesterday, and they all have exactly the same problem. So it's obviously a Verizon problem. So I got on the phone this morning at about 5 o'clock. It was right after I woke up, and I'm angrily telling Verizon that I don't want to hear this about the problem being on our end, and I'm talking to this woman, and she's just giving me the standard rote answers. She's infuriatingly polite, of course.
Right.
And I asked her at some point, I was just curious.
They treat you like you're an idiot, like you've never used your computer before.
That's right.
Yeah. Did you try restarting the computer?
That's right, and restarting the router. I said about 100 times. So then I said, just sort of popped into my head. I was wondering where she was. So I said, "Where are you?" And she said, "I am in the Philippines, sir."
Oh, wow.
So here's the irony is we have a Verizon repair station about a quarter mile down the road from us.
Yeah.
But, and they're the ones who presumably should be working on this and fixing it. Meanwhile, I'm talking to a woman in the Philippines who is supposed to be handling this problem.
Telling you how to use your computer. Yeah.
That's right. So anyway...
that's horrible.
So now, I should just tell people what's going on here. We are actually talking through a conference phone set up by Blogging Heads, so they can record the audio of this right now and start preparing the menu of topics and everything. And then I'm supposed to put my end of this recording, the video, on a data stick and FedEx it to Blogging Heads so they can put it together tomorrow morning.
Well, the FedEx for the bandwidth of FedEx is actually higher than anything available anywhere in the world online, including Korea. So you can send more data faster, especially if you have a huge bulk of data. So like all these observatories that do electronic astronomy, they actually send the data into headquarters by FedEx.
Oh, that's really interesting because their
disks.
files are too big to send by the internet.
It's actually faster. I actually wrote something once when I used that idea for a lead for a week in review piece, and I made a calculation of what the bandwidth was of FedEx, like if you ordered the complete set of the Sopranos or something, and then how long it would take to download it over the fastest connection that you could reasonably expect to have. And, of course, it was vastly longer than it would take to get it by overnight mail with FedEx.
Wow, it's interesting. We're sort of in this weird hybrid period of telecommunications. I had another problem last fall when we tried to sign up for high-definition TV. So I've got these two teenage kids, and we decided to spruce up their playroom, so I went out and bought one of these gigantic 42-inch high-definition TVs.
Wow!
And we set it. My son and I set it up. I got it from Best Buy, and of course wait a minute. It was Circuit City, and of course they tried to convince us to hire them to set it up. But my son and I
after they
did
sold you the extended warranty.
I never take those extended warranties. I've learned my lesson. But then we got DirecTV. We decided to have them provide us with high-def TV service.
That's satellite?
Yeah, this is satellite service. And this guy came, and we already had DirecTV regular television service, so they just needed to upgrade it. And this guy came. He spent about 4 or 5 hours working on, going around the outside of the house and doing all this stuff on the inside of the house. And finally, he turned it on, and it didn't really work. It only, we got like 1 or 2 channels. Almost all of them weren't coming through in high def. And he said, I kind of thought this might happen. You've got some trees in the way of the signal. And I was like,
trees in the way of the signal?
Yeah. So I said, well, why? It was like 8 o'clock at night by this time. Yeah. And so the guy, I said, geez, what should we do? And he goes, well, the signal might improve. It's almost fall. The leaves are going to fall from the trees. So I was like, okay, we'll give it a shot. And then the signal actually got worse over the next week because it started raining a little bit. And when it rained, we completely lost the signal. Oh, and so then I decided to disconnect. And DirecTV told us that we had to pay like a $300 disconnect fee to disconnect from the service that they had never provided us.
Well, see, that's where they make their money.
Yeah. But it was so I called them and tried to explain that we never actually had it's not like I'm disconnecting something you gave us. You never gave it to us. They are still. This happened last September. They are still sending all these threatening letters to me, demanding their actually.
It's horrible. What you said is so true. We're stuck in this kind of limbo between the wonderful new digital future and at the same time we're half mired in the past.
Yeah, it's.
I don't know if our listeners realize that the standard way you do a Blogging Heads conversation like this is that we record the audio-video track on our own hard disks locally, and then only when we're done we use FTP to send it to central headquarters in Omaha or wherever it is, Princeton, Washington, and then they put it all together with their editing skills.
Yeah.
So, that's really, there's something really funny about that. And
it still takes...
These things always remind me of that Terry Gilliam movie, Brazil.
Right. With the pneumatic tubes?
Pneumatic tubes. That's right. We did we got off on a pneumatic tube tangent here once on Science Saturday. But,
yeah.
Yeah. So, it's kind of funny now when you think that, I have my telephone line, I have my DSL connection, and then over my DSL connection I can use Skype, or any of these VoIP services to talk on the telephone. So I have my telephone line kind of giving me a digital connection on top of which I'm simulating a telephone connection. And then you could go another level and then use Skype through a dial-up modem or something, and
it's
just
very,
keep stacking all these levels of the house of cards.
It's very for some people. Well, it's confusing for me, but it's completely baffling to lots of people. I was just at a party last week and ran into this guy, and we were talking about all the problems we have with our computers and televisions and telephones and so forth. And I was saying that I, sort of half jokingly saying that I rely for tech help on my 14-year-old son, Mac, which I often do. He's especially good at providing his mother with Mac tech support. His name is Mac, and he's also a Macintosh specialist.
Perfect.
And this guy said, "I got to hire your son," and I sort of responded, "Ha ha," and then he's looking at me going, "No, I mean it. Can I hire your son?" Wow. Yeah, he said, "I'll pay him $25 an hour." So my wife and I are going over. We're still trying to decide whether this is an ethical issue or not, or whether we should just let our son work for this guy. And
what would the ethical argument be?
I don't know.
Child
whether or not,
labor.
yeah, something like that, or whether or not, because this person is sort of a friend, and should we have our son making money off him? And
Oh yeah, I mean it's no different than when kids used to babysit for the neighbors, right?
good point. Yeah, maybe it was just the amount of money, $25 an hour. But
Oh yeah, I think you should go for it.
He's being paid as an expert. He should get a premium.
Yeah, and I'm sure if he, it costs a lot more to get an established expert out of the phone book. So.
Oh, absolutely. And you can't really trust those people anyway because of the expert service problem.
As you've shown. Well, somehow we'll cobble this show together.
Yeah, but we've already burned up 10 minutes, so only about 50 minutes to go.
Yeah, okay, so science.
Yeah, so what's been happening?
Saturday.
I haven't even, I've been pretty disconnected from things over the last week. So
have you been getting your newspaper?
I did skim the New York Times, the Science Times last Tuesday, and I know that there was a big piece by Natalie Angier in it, but beyond that, I can't really tell you.
On political animals, and then you saw the one yesterday by Andy Pollock on Craig Ventnor and he cobbled together the entire genome of a bacterium.
Oh, I guess I did see that briefly before I was disconnected. Didn't Venter talk about that with Carl Zimmer a few months ago?
Yeah, I think he did. Yeah, he was working on it. On it then.
He's trying to build a cell from scratch, right?
Yeah, right.
Bacteria.
Yeah, it's the cell is it's actually a venereal disease that he's building, which I thought was
great.
Kind of strange, but it's
what a choice.
So what was the name of it? It's mycoplasma something.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I guess they picked it because it's one of the very simplest of bacteriums.
Mm-hmm.
Those bacteria. So it's called Mycoplasma genitalium.
What an evocative name.
I mean, it's apparently just like one of the most stripped-down, basic little life forms beyond a virus, if you consider a virus a life form. That's a
I kind of imagine this is like a penis-shaped cell.
Oh, I don't know. I'd imagine that's not true, but the whole genome consists, it says, of about 500 million base pairs.
Ah, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but how does that compare with the human genome?
You shouldn't have asked.
Sorry, George.
It must be many times greater. It's probably here in Andy's story, but I mean, it's kind of neat. I guess basically you can get these off-the-shelf little snippets of DNA that have been done with these DNA sequencing machines that are now ubiquitous in biomolecular laboratories, and then he was able to come up, he and his team over the years, starting in 2002, with a way to splice these together into the entire genome of this very, very simple bacterium. And I guess this is part of the first step, or the first big step toward making the artificial cell that you mentioned.
Well, what's interesting about this research is that they still have to start with a kind of cellular skeleton, as I understand it, or sort of a genomic foundation, and then they add things to that. What they can't do yet is really build something, build a living thing totally from scratch,
from the bottom up,
with compounds.
Yeah. So this mycoplasma, basically they've made the mycoplasma's chromosome, but then they have to inject that into another mycoplasma bacterium to make a self-replicating that bacteria that they're going to call Mycoplasma laboratorium.
Yeah.
So it's being billed as the first artificial organism, which it sort of will be, but as you said, you have to start with a bacterium that already evolved there from nature to have the scaffolding to do this.
Well, so this gets at the origin of life question, because there's been this attempt going back at least to the 50s to build living things completely from scratch, just starting with chemicals under some sort of plausible conditions that would have resembled what you had in the Earth, say, 4 billion years ago.
Right.
And there was this famous experiment with that Stanley Miller and Harold Urey carried out in 1953, I think, in which they stuck a bunch of compounds in a beaker and heated it and sort of added some electricity to simulate lightning, and then they got amino acids out of it, which are the precursors of proteins, and so it looked like we were going to really be able to create life from scratch just with a little bit more research, and it just hasn't happened. It's still one of the most profoundly puzzling problems that there is.
Well, yeah, and there's still the whole question of which came first, the the protein chicken or the DNA egg, and
yes.
And this all reminded me of Venter in the story was talking about the quest to find the how did he put it, the minimal genome, the minimal sequence, genetic sequence that would code for an organism that could be alive, self-sustaining, self-replicating, what the minimum genome would be. And it reminded me of this work that Harold Morowitz, who, he's at George Mason University, and he's also associated with the Santa Fe Institute, has done on what he calls the universal metabolism, or the universal metabolic chart. So basically, he's a biochemist by training, and just in looking at the Krebs cycle and all of this stuff that you're exposed to in college biology classes, for every organism there's of course a huge amount of overlap, because it all evolved presumably from the same primitive kind of metabolic cycle in the beginning in the primordial seas. So Harold has come down like with the most stripped down metabolic chart that he can come up with, and the last time I really talked to him about this, I think he had like 50 simple molecules, and if you had these 50 simple molecules and you put them together, you could get a self-replicating metabolism.
But
so this would be like the core of life.
But has he been able to?
No.
Sort of, okay. So he hasn't been able to take those compounds and then put them together under conditions that would simulate, the warm broth.
No, that would be a story.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
but the thing that interested me about Harold was, there's this whole endless debate of, did DNA come first because you have to have the self-replicating abilities of DNA, or did proteins come first because you have to have the protein catalyst to encourage these biochemical reactions in the metabolic chart to occur. So what Harold was finding was this handful of molecules that could form a metabolism, and they could do it without protein enzymes.
Oh, really? What was it?
Yeah.
So
they could kind of boots. I'd have to go back and look and see just what they were, but the basic idea was that you would have this simple little chemical system. It's self-sustaining, and maybe not self-replicating at first, but self-sustaining. And then it didn't require complex proteins as enzymes. It's all just simple chemicals, and it would be able to kind of chug along without the proteins. And then at some point, it would discover nitrogen. And once it discovered nitrogen, it could make amino acids, and and the rest is history. And then become a more efficient organism by having enzymes and things. And then he imagines it starting out with just these kind of vesicles, these lipid vesicles, which are, you can get chains of lipid molecules that will naturally close to form a little self-enclosed container. And so these are floating around empty in the primordial sea, and then occasionally, they're gonna split open and divide, and these bubbles basically, and then the bubble's going to trap a few chemicals, and then eventually you get one of the bubbles that has the core of the metabolic chart and starts being able to sustain itself, and then it discovers nitrogen and learns how to make proteins, and then the amino acid replication might come later.
Well, I wonder how this fits in with the RNA world hypothesis. It sounds like this it precedes that. So the you just
this would come before RNA. So it would
Yeah.
say in the beginning there were these fatty vesicle bubbles, and then there was the simple core metabolism, and then this more complex chemistry came later.
And that sort of provided a laboratory that would allow for the development or evolution of more complex molecules.
Exactly,
and,
a laboratory,
and
Mycoplasma laboratorium.
That's right.
But even more basic. Yeah, so that's kind of cool stuff. I hope I'm not muddling Harold's theory, because it's been a long time since I wrote about that. But it just kind of flashed back to me when I read Ventnor talking about the minimal genome.
Well, I'll just add that the RNA world hypothesis, and I guess this would involve a later stage in chemical evolution, it depends on the finding that RNA, which is just sort of it was thought to be kind of a handmaiden for DNA that helped it replicate. Turns out that, I guess this was discovered sometime in the 1980s, that RNA can actually serve as an enzyme, a catalyst for genetic replication itself. So instead of having this dichotomy between proteins that act as enzymes on the one hand and the genetic material, DNA, on the other side, you can have one compound, RNA, that acts as its own enzyme as it replicates. And so that's thought to have been a very important stepping stone toward the evolution of life, but it's just another theory in a field that...
it's a lot more widely accepted, I think, than Harold's is, but...
Yeah.
But it's also got its problems, so...
Hey, since we're talking about microbial stuff, I want to mention a story that I've had. I'm reliant on hard copies of stories that I've got in my Blogging Heads folder, and this is one that I've wanted to mention for a while because it's just a classic, really nice, self-contained scientific discovery. This goes back to, I think it was last December. It's a story by Gina Colada on flu and why flu epidemics tend to happen in the winter. So there have been all these theories, but nobody has had a really satisfying explanation. Most of the theories have to do with that we have weakened immune systems, or we tend to be in enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces more often. But there was a story, an article in, I think it was the New England Journal of Medicine, I guess this was originally the Journal of the American Medical Association. There was an article back in 1919 that was discovered by some modern flu researchers that had a kind of offhand reference, and this 1919 was during one of the big flu epidemics. Yeah. And there was a researcher who in this 1909 paper noted that while humans are dying of flu, there are also some guinea pigs in a laboratory at this camp in New Mexico. This is Camp Cody in New Mexico. The guinea pigs also were dying. Yeah. And the study's authors wrote they thought the animals at first had died from food poisoning, but they did autopsies and found that they had died of pneumonia. So a modern researcher discovered this paper with this little offhand reference to dying guinea pigs, and he decided to run an experiment with guinea pigs who were exposed to flu viruses at different humidities and temperatures. And he found that as the temperature and humidity decrease, the infectiousness of the viruses, of the flu virus, increases. And it's optimal at about 41 degrees and 20% humidity.
Wow. So I would have guessed it would be just the opposite.
Yeah. So it's, the flu virus apparently is, is sustained better in very dry, cold conditions, and that's why we tend to transmit it when it's cold.
Oh, I missed that story, I guess, because that's really striking.
Yeah, isn't that nice?
Yeah, because it's just so crisp and it's so counterintuitive. Because I think of, it's the steamy, hot, tropical kind of atmospheres that you would imagine, would breed all kinds of stuff, including flu.
Yeah,
but that would apply more probably to once you got to the level of the bacterium instead of the virus, which is
yeah. Well, this.
That's very cool.
I haven't seen any challenges to this theory, so I guess it seems to be. They quote some experts at the Centers for Disease Control saying that this really seems to be the explanation. But it did remind me of a theory that was proposed by a brilliant astrophysicist, Fred Hoyle, back in I think this was the late '80s. He had a paper in Nature with Wickrama Singh. Do you remember this?
Yeah, all the diseases from outer space.
That's right. So Hoyle and Wickrama Singh had this theory that outer space is pervaded by viruses and bacteria, and they tracked flu epidemics with. They said that they correlated with high levels of sunspots. And they thought that the sunspots, you got an increase in the solar wind, and the solar wind was sort of blowing the flu virus
space
down
germs
on the Earth, and they actually had these charts correlating the epidemic peaks with peaks in sunspots.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And Hoyle thought that NASA had actually discussed, so he was telling me this when I interviewed him back in the early 90s. And I said, well, if outer space is loaded with all of these microbes, how come we haven't discovered them, with like balloons and all these missions to outer space and so forth? And he said, oh, we have, but it's been suppressed. So he thought that NASA and all these other organizations have actually discovered all these things out there, but they suppressed it because I guess they thought it would freak people out or would upset the medical and scientific establishment and so forth.
And HIV was engineered in a biochemical laboratory as a tool of genocide by the Bechtel Corporation.
Actually, he did say that.
He said something not quite that ridiculous, but
yeah, he said that he thought that it was probably a military experiment that had gone awry. He didn't
that's
say
what
it was deliberately released, but he
there was a really good biography of Hoyle that I reviewed a couple years ago that got into some of that toward the end.
Yeah, he was a really interesting figure because I thought here was somebody who really helped to apply physics to the understanding of the early universe and nucleosynthesis in stars. But so he was brilliant, very creative, and he had some really important contributions, especially to the understanding of the evolution of stars. But there was this very thin line between being a sort of productive maverick challenging the mainstream in science and becoming just a wacko. So by the time you start saying that there are these conspiracy theories among scientists to suppress the truth, then I think you really lose your credibility.
Yeah. That always reminds me of the Nikola Tesla cult. These people that think that Nikola Tesla had solved all of our energy problems with a way to beam energy effortlessly all around the world, and then and then his secrets were suppressed. And actually, he was talking to someone the other week that I met, and he was expressing the view, I don't know if he held it, but at least some of his friends did, that when Tesla died, the federal government seized all of his papers and have kept them secret ever since.
Oh, it's because the oil companies and the
right.
they have so much vested in their way of making money that they crush all these.
These, it's like the electric car that works perfectly and is in a secret hangar in Detroit, and we'll never get to see it.
Right. The problem with that is it happens on a trivial level, but if something can make somebody money, it cannot.
Someone
be
will figure out how to do it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It will. I mean, that is one of the great benefits of our free market system. And even the oil companies would seize on it. They'd try to buy up the patents, and then they wouldn't suppress it. They would try to, make zillions of dollars off that. Why not?
Well, yeah, and if you have an electric car, you've got to plug it in anyway to charge it, and so it's all coming from fossil fuels or nuclear at some point.
Yes.
Unless you have a fuel cell car, of course, and that sounds like that could happen.
Well, that's. I'm hoping that will be the direction. I'm hoping that some of these clever kids at my school will figure out how to solve our energy problems and, along with them, all our environmental problems.
Yeah.
Well, so what else? What else?
We had the piece by Natalie. That was kind of interesting.
What did she say?
The headline was "Political Animals, Yes Animals." Well, she was basically talking about just various studies of, like dolphins, for example, and how they organize themselves into, three nested tiers of friends and accomplices. So they start forming this little hierarchy just naturally, and they maintain alliances by signaling each other, by in the way they twist and spin through the water, and it was kind of a nice essay that was sort of a reminder that a lot of the things we think began with human beings, like politics and all these complex social systems, of course began much earlier on, and that they're, in some form throughout the animal kingdom.
Yeah. So was she making all these jokey references to Obama and Hillary Clinton and what these animals do provides insights into some of the behavior of the presidential candidates?
Yeah, that was basically the theme, and and it really rang true. You have your alpha male, your alpha female, and then you have the people trying to curry favor because they can get political appointments, and this is not so different from figuring out who the most vicious wolf is in the pack and making sure that wolf likes you because that's the one that's going to get the biggest hunting territory, and you can be his little minion like a Chicago ward boss and and get your little payoff. And the thing that really struck me was a quote by it's a primatologist at the University of Chicago who said that individuals don't fight for food, space, or resources, they fight for power. Because with power and status, then they'll have control of everything else. So, they are fighting for food, space, and resources, but they go one level deeper and fight for the power that will give that to them. And, it's, again, it rings true. It's nothing really surprising, but it was really neat how she tied it into politics with these little side references to the current campaigns.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, the issue of why people fight is, as you might imagine, highly contentious. So, there are some anthropologists. What this guy is saying is linking fighting to male attempts to gain more power and elevate their status. That's very similar to what Richard Wrangham, an anthropologist at Harvard, has been saying based on his studies of chimpanzees. So among chimpanzees, you usually have one alpha male who's very dominant in a troop and uses violence for tactical reasons, both within the troop to suppress rivals, and even to you will sometimes rape females. Alpha males will kill offspring of other males within the troop. But also, males within one troop will band together and go out and patrol their territory and raid other troops and kill them.
Yeah.
So, and this is really what Wrangham is saying, is this isn't linked so much to the fight for resources as much as it is to these status and dominance struggles. But there are all these other researchers who say that the struggle for resources is absolutely important. So Franz de Waal, another primatologist, he's at Emory University in Georgia. He has shown that you can dramatically affect the degree of conflict both within a troop and between different troops by changing the amount of available food. So he said if you have more food, conflict drops and there's more sharing within the troop and so forth. So that's, so it's obviously a combination of the quest for power on the part of males and the struggle for resources. And I think you can see that just in the wars that we have nowadays. So the United States obviously is an extremely wealthy country. We're not like we're not invading Iraq because we lack resources. Although you could argue that we are in a sense as well, because obviously oil is an issue there.
Right, blood for oil. I mean, that's just a ridiculously simplistic explanation of this complex phenomenon of the current war. But it's happening down, buried in some level, maybe mostly subliminal, maybe less subliminal than I like to think, and then it's also tied in with all the memes floating around, and once you develop brains and you can have a memosphere as well as a genosphere, people are motivated by ideas and causes and patriotism and all of this stuff, and then but at the same time, the reason that gets reinforced is because it gives you more power, and then you have access to more resources and you thrive. So it's interestingly tangled up.
It's absolutely tangled up, but there are a lot of social scientists who believe, and I think it just makes sense, that if you raise the standard of living in, let's say, in the Congo, where you've had this horrible conflict going on for so many years, that you'll reduce the fighting. And a lot of that fighting is kind of Malthusian. You've got these rising populations, less land per person, less food and other resources, and so the fighting is on that kind of very basic level. Whereas other wars, it's definitely more complicated. But in terms of males being tough and aggressive and in search of power, and that's why we go to war. It's the connection again is very complicated, even if you look at our recent history. So George Bush was somebody who avoided combat himself during the Vietnam War and wasn't even involved in contact sports. He was a cheerleader in college. So obviously, this is not a person who's aggressive in the conventional sense, and yet obviously he's a complete warmonger.
Right. Well, he's part of the structure. Part
of the structure of the government that he's within.
Yeah, and the group, and his little, and his, the group of, the pack of wolves that all groom each other and reinforce each other's ideas and tell each other how clever they are and how stupid everyone else is, and circulate the memes and stroke each other mimetically, and then take us to war.
Yeah. Well, my hope is that war is still so poorly understood, and my hope is this is something I've been harping on for a long time on this show. My hope is that there will be. I would urge those young people out there, any young people who are interested in science and also in current affairs and all the problems that beset the world, I would urge them to take up the problem of warfare and study it with the purpose of figuring out in a more concrete way why we fight and what we can do to reduce the frequency of warfare.
Yeah, and it's very inspiring. And in politics is really this kind of this interesting, very stylized version of the same thing.
Yeah.
Political struggle, and that's I guess what Natalie's story was kind of like a nice splash of cold water in the face, because during these campaigns, I guess I operate under this idealistic assumption that I know deep down is wrong, that this is about a debate about ideas.
Right.
A political campaign is a debate about ideas, and that turns out, of course, just to be this tiny little thin membrane on top of what's really going on, which is this very biologically rooted power struggles. And one of the really cool, Natalie ended with this really cool point. Like, have you ever stopped to think about why whales click at each other and clack as they swim through the ocean?
No, although I do have a friend who's writing a whole book on whale song now, and I assume he will.
Oh, well, maybe, yeah, you should ask him about this, because it could be a form of voting.
Voting?
Yeah, like time to stop here and synchronously dive down in search of a deep water squid, or now it's time to resurface, or now we go left, now we go right. So it's a way they communicate in this pack formation, which would be like, birds flying in packs and, communicating with these little local signals, like what this bird's doing, and then you do that, or you do the opposite. But you can think of this as voting and coming up with some kind of consensus of what you're supposed to do. So it's a neat little device, and
yeah, that's I'll have to ask. So the guy I know is writing this book, David Rothenberg. He already wrote a book on bird song, came out about a year ago, and so now he's doing something on whale communication, and I think his thesis was that mainly it's music that whales are singing to themselves. He's suspicious of functional explanations.
Really? So it's just for their own amusement?
Yeah, although, I think obviously it's probably some kind of combination, just as it is with humans.
It seems like it's inevitable that, if whales had that ability and were doing it just because they got some nice sort of endorphin high from, listening to themselves, that at some point this would be seized upon as a communications device.
Yeah.
Be evolutionarily favored. Then you get into the old group selection and all that.
Just going back to the presidential election, I and what we're really looking for in candidates, and whether it's our choices are rational or not. There was a really interesting article in the New Yorker that I just read by George Packer, I think, on the differences between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And he says that they represent two really different styles of political leadership, or potential styles. So Hillary is presenting herself as a really tough manager who will take on all these problems and find solutions and then shove them through a recalcitrant Congress. So it's management and problem solving, very pragmatically oriented. That's how she's presenting herself. Whereas Barack Obama, according to Packer's analysis, and he quotes all these people who are sort of reinforcing this dichotomy between the two. Obama, he sees as more of an inspirational, charismatic leader.
Yeah.
Who it's not necessarily his specific ideas or solutions to problems that appeal to people. He just sort of imbues people with a sense of hope. He inspires them, even though they're not, there might not necessarily be any specific content to the feeling. It's sort of an emotional feeling, the inspiration that people sense when they listen to him, and they want to contribute to their country. They want to get involved. They want, at the very least, to vote for Barack Obama. But the article quoted somebody, I think it was somebody who's worked very closely with the Clintons, who was trying to explain why he's now in the Barack Obama camp. And he said that Obama reminds him of Bobby Kennedy, who also had this kind of inspirational, charismatic quality that transcended the specifics of his agenda.
Yeah.
And, they sort of went to, and actually, if you remember that little dust-up over Hillary's comments on Martin Luther King several weeks ago, it was really about this very issue. So Clinton was saying that, Martin Luther King was this inspirational, charismatic figure who got people involved. He got them on the streets. They were protesting in large numbers. But then she said it took a president, it took Lyndon Johnson to actually pass laws that...
Yeah, the Great Society. Yeah.
Right. That,
you need someone who knew how to play politics and get things done and form these alliances and get people to return your favors and to accrue the debts in the first place so you can take advantage of them. You have to be a strategist.
Right.
Yeah.
And you have to recognize that there can be this fierce opposition to what you want to do, and you have to fight against that, work very hard against it. So she's sort of implicitly belittling the role of inspiration and saying that, okay, maybe that's a necessary first step, but then you need a leader who can do the hard work of implementing these changes.
Ideas are a dime a dozen. It's the execution of them that's so rare. Yeah. It's a dilemma, but on the other hand, you could get someone who's a very inspirational leader who would then attract the political technocrats that can pull these things off, which is sort of, basically the Bush phenomenon.
Yeah,
taken in the other direction.
And in the case of Obama, the hope is that he will draw people with his sort of inspirational, more sort of positive-oriented approach to politics, he will attract people from different parts of the political spectrum, from people on the right as well as the left, whereas Clinton, if she's going in there with an idea that I've got to fight for every little incremental change, if she will keep antagonizing people on the right and Republicans.
Yeah.
And
it could all be a repeat of when her national health insurance drive, has the organizational skill and the political acumen to put together this great program, but not to inspire the opposition to embrace it or to come up with some kind of compromise.
Yeah. There was, the writer, Packer, is saying how he listened to Barack Obama give a speech in New Hampshire, and I guess this was when he was, everybody thought he was really surging. It was before the actual primary, and he listened to him, and he felt this great sort of upwelling of emotion, and he was filled with hope and so forth.
Yeah, right.
And he describes it. Then he says, a couple hours later, he's trying to remember exactly what Obama had said, and he can't remember a single thing.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. He seemed to be, the writer wasn't necessarily showing his preference for one style over another. He seemed to be really sitting on the fence himself.
Yeah. And at some point, you just kind of, tip one way or the other when you're in the caucus or in the primary voting booth.
Right. So we'll find out soon enough.
Yeah, I guess we have a caucus coming up here in New Mexico. It's the first year we've had caucuses instead of a primary. Mm-hmm. I think it's the first time. At least it's the first time that I remember.
And Richardson is officially out now. Richardson, who I wrongly identified as Republican, in the past.
Richardson, he's back. He came back, to Santa Fe and said, well, he put up a good fight, and now he's back to being our governor.
Mm-hmm.
And, immediately started doing some very, very decisive things. Like there's this oil company that bought up a huge amount of oil and gas rights south of Santa Fe in the Galisteo Basin. Mm-hmm. There's this beautiful, beautiful country down there. And, so there's the specter of having it turn into, something like, an Amarillo, Texas oil field. And, of course, there's huge opposition coming from Santa Fe, from both the environmentalists and the people who live down there, who went down there to get out of the city and into the, the beautiful landscape, and then they're, faced with the fact that they don't own the oil rights under their feet. So one of the first things that Richardson did was to declare a moratorium on drilling until they get all this straightened out and decide how they can regulate it.
Uh-huh.
But there's only so much you can do, if you don't own your own mineral rights. But yeah, it's what I've said before. Like Richardson's aspirations to the presidency have been very good for New Mexico, because it's he's really pushed through a lot of stuff to get on his resume, and we all benefit from it.
Right. So it all comes down to selfishness in the end. It's all a demonstration of Richard Dawkins' selfish genes.
Yeah. It all comes down to politics, and politics all comes down to biology.
Well, so I've got some other things in my file here.
Yeah, how are we running on time here?
I think
we must be pretty close to an hour.
Yeah, it seems that way, doesn't it? I got 51 minutes on this end.
15?
I've got 51.
There was one thing I wanted to ask you about.
Sure. Oh, well, I'll just mention...
you go first. Yeah.
Great stories of science that have broken recently that we haven't had a chance to mention. There's one.
Yeah.
Non-stick gum. So there's a guy, Professor Terence Cosgrove of Bristol University. He has spent a lot of time in quest of a gum that doesn't stick to your shoes. Turns out that city governments in Britain spend $305 million a year cleaning up chewing gum.
Really?
That seems incredible.
Wow. Here they just leave it, and it gets on your shoes, and it's really a drag. But
well, so apparently
they don't even pick up the trash along the streets in Santa Fe.
Well, apparently this is a real problem. Actually, they've got a photograph of a street in England, in London, which is covered with chewing gum. So this guy has come up with a type of gum that apparently doesn't kind of get ground into pavement or doesn't stick to your shoes. And so he's going to try
I can see a Nobel Prize in the future.
Sure, well, why not? Science marches on. The chewing gum industry just in Western Europe is about $5 billion a year. Jesus Christ!
Wow.
Numbers involved in this.
Huh.
So, chewing gum.
Wow, I don't feel like I see a lot of people like chewing gum when I'm walking down the street or on an airplane or.
We're not allowed to chew gum in my house because Susie's got some kind of, I think it was ingrained in her when she was a girl by her mother that chewing gum is vulgar. And so I like chewing gum. So I come into the house and I'm chewing, I sometimes I forget. I usually just chew when I'm all by myself because I know it will upset Susie. But sometimes I'll be chewing and I'll come into the house and then she'll spot me and she'll go, I'm doing an exaggerated chewing motion. She'll make fun of my chewing. And so I don't really understand it. My kids like chewing too, but basically we can't chew here.
Huh. I never really saw the point of chewing gum. But...
Oh, it's refreshing, and it exercises your jaw muscles. It's kind of like doing blogging heads.
Okay.
So what else? You said you wanted to ask me about some.
Yeah. Oh, it was your talk with Jim Holt. Philosopher, mathematician Jim Holt. That was a really nice conversation.
Oh, well, thank you.
I really enjoyed that. I'd never met Jim Holt. But
he did most of the talking.
Yeah, well, I thought it was pretty balanced.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I'd never met him, but he reviewed one of my books. Which one? A Shortcut Through Time.
Oh.
My book. And he reviewed that in the New York Times Book Review, and it was a really great, funny review. And to this day, I don't really know if it was favorable or not.
He's one of these reviewers. I know we would never do this, but he sees reviews as an opportunity for one-liners and kind of snarky comments and digressions and.
But he also makes some pretty interesting sort of philosophical points. The line in this review that I really liked is that he accused me of violating the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
In what sense?
And I think that might have been a compliment. He said this man should be arrested for violating the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Yeah.
Which is a great line.
Do you really know what that means?
Well, it was either a compliment saying that I'd written with such clarity in explaining quantum computing. So that's one interpretation, or I guess it could have been a dig at me seeming overly optimistic and not doubting that we're going to have quantum computers in our future. But I don't think that's what he meant. But he may have meant neither one. But anyway, I really enjoyed the conversation, and it was the second one he'd done on Blogging Head. So I first saw him in that talk with the philosopher on immortality. But you were talking about that story that Dennis Overby wrote about giant brains floating in the universe, and I just thought it was funny because after that story appeared, I was at a dinner party at a friend's house, and a guy was there visiting from Denver, and we started talking about what do you do, write about science for the New York Times, and then that was the first thing that came up was the story about the brains floating out in the universe. This just really struck people, even though I'm wondering if a lot of people kind of missed the point.
I thought that, the only point I can see, I assume Dennis doesn't take this seriously, and even the scientists themselves don't take it seriously. The point, it's just a classic one of those stories coming from physics or cosmology,
right? Where
it's just, look at the weird shit these people are thinking up now.
Yeah, and that's how Dennis kind of framed it. It was kind of this wonderfully tongue-in-cheek kind of story. But I think a lot of people, you find that when you try to write with irony, that it doesn't always work. And I just wondered if these people were really coming away with the thought that physicists were seriously wondering about disembodied brains floating in space. And I thought there was a good column on that by Sean Carroll on his physics blog, and he was basically complimenting Dennis on the story and noting how early on he had framed this in such a way that people would know that this was really this kind of off-the-wall, reductio ad absurdum argument, but that he kind of wondered if people would pick up on that.
Yeah,
basically the idea that if you're going to explain the existence of the universe and how we have order in the midst of all this entropy and the second law of dynamics, if you're going to say, oh well, it's just this random fluctuation, kind of this back eddy where you get this little pocket of order, but then it's as I understand it, what they're saying is it's obviously much more likely you'll get simpler orders. And it's much more likely that a whole bunch of molecules would just chance to come together to form a brain that was equipped with all these memories of having a life on Earth in a place that had this history and a science and a history of science and thinking and the illusion that it's living in the society and talking to friends and neighbors and living out this life. That would take a lot less. The probability of that would be a whole lot higher than having something like the real universe come together.
It's like the Matrix, man.
But I don't know, it just seemed to me that just another way of saying that, if you have a world that's of infinite extent or lasts for an infinite amount of time, or both, basically anything that happens is going to happen again and again and again. It was what Poincaré called, Poincaré's return.
It was also, I think, before Poincaré, Nietzsche said it. It was the doctrine of eternal recurrence. If you have eternal time and
it's a kind
space,
of
all things must happen over and over again. And what does that imply for our quest for meaning right here and now? It's something that you really shouldn't think about too much, or you certainly shouldn't take it seriously.
No, and you definitely don't want to just ruin your life sitting around worrying about the eternal recurrence.
Right. Yeah. Everything you do, all those stupid things you do, will be repeated over and over again. This conversation, George, will happen an infinite number of times. Oh, no.
Oh, God. I thought. Well, and it ties in with Buddhism, reincarnation, and all of that. Although then you're reincarnated as different things. So this is like you're reincarnated as exactly the same being doing the same thing, and I just don't see where the argument gets you anywhere. It's just it's funny that if anything can happen, it will. And
Sean Carroll says, well, he's glad that Dennis framed this as something that shouldn't be taken too seriously. On the other hand, Sean, as I recall, is a supporter of the landscape theory and the anthropic principle and all these other things that I think are beyond the pale of respectable science. So,
yeah, we know you do.
To me, it's just all pathology. It's all pathology.
Yeah,
high IQ pathology, and fun.
Well, it's getting to the edge of what it's possible to think about or understand. And
no, it's beyond the edge, George.
You think? Well, we'll see. We'll see. The Large Hadron Collider may put some constraints on the theorizing.
Oh, that'll be the day.
Yeah.
Hey, we've gone over an hour.
Oh, okay, so we did it.
Yeah. So now I gotta take this thing, put it on a data stick, and ship it by by Federal Express, the champion in broadband communication.
Yeah. That's great. Yep, it's Terry Gilliam's Brazil.
Yeah. So, all right, I don't know if... Hey, are you talking to Wolfram or what?
Oh,
Steve Wolfram.
Not next week. Stephen Wolfram,
the complexity
I'm
theorist.
supposed to talk to him in a couple of weeks, I think it is.
Yeah, talk about pathological science. Anyway, that should be interesting.
Maybe we should talk again next week, unless you have something else.
No, that would be fun.
Yeah, we need to redeem ourselves, because I think this was not one of our better efforts.
Oh, don't say that. Let the Blogging Heads audience decide. Anyway,
well, yeah, but...
and they will, I'm sure. Okay, so I'm ready to sign off when you are.
Okay, and I hope you get your internet connection back. I mean, that's horrible. It's that's worse than not having water almost.
It's funny. It's extremely distressing and kind of exhilarating at the same time.
Well, yeah, actually, I'll just mention one more thing before we sign off. A few days ago, we woke up and we didn't have any water in our house.
Ah.
And it had been getting into single-digit temperatures for several nights. And I thought, oh, great, the water main's frozen somewhere. But then I called my neighbor across the street, and he had water. So I thought, oh, God, we have a broken pipe or something. But it turns out that our water meter froze.
Ah.
It got so cold, the water meter froze.
Wow.
And maybe that happens in the East, but I've never heard of it happening in New Mexico. But that's how cold it got. And the water company came out with a big blowtorch and thawed it out. And then they said they wanted to stuff some insulation down in the water meter hole, but they'd run out because they had all these frozen meters, and they asked me if I had any. So I went out and back to the shed, and I found an old blanket and brought it back. And they said, oh, yeah, that'll be fine. So they stuffed a blanket down the hole and sealed it up again, and hopefully our water won't freeze.
Yeah, I do.
But it was really strange being without water. Even for half a day, you're reminded of
Yeah.
how dependent you are on it.
Civilization is just a paper-thin veneer.
Yeah, but when you lose your internet connection, that would have had me panicking. With water, I thought, well, we can drain out what's in the hot water heaters and use that for washing, and eventually we can go borrow some from the neighbor, but internet connection, I just start getting really panicky.
Well, I'm glad you've got your priorities in place.
I hope you're back online soon, John, and
thanks
same
a lot,
time,
George.
same station next week, I hope.
Sounds good. All right.
Okay,